Good morning from MIT, and hello to all of you joining us virtually across the United States and around the world. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the AI Policy Forum's second symposium. I'm David Edelman from MIT's Internet Policy Research Initiative, and it's again an honor to be your host for this exciting series of discussions at the forefront of how we move from principles to practice in governing AI and designing AI systems to be governed. For those of you who joined us at our last symposium, you heard about some of the groundbreaking work that the AI Policy Forum and all of us participating in it are doing, bringing together technical and public policy experts along with civil society and government leaders to forge a path forward at a time when AI applications are increasingly present across sectors in the United States and globally. You heard from some of the task forces on finance, mobility, and healthcare that were charting a path on new research at that intersection of technical AI system design and practical public policy design. And you heard from some of the leadership here at MIT that is helping to drive this forward, all under the auspices of the Schwarzman College of Computing. Now, today, we're going to go deeper on some of those topics and some new ones that's bringing all of our work together. In our first segment today, we're going to hear about some cross-cutting topics in AI policy. As many of you know, last year has seen some substantial changes in the regulatory and policy landscape around AI in the United States, in China, and perhaps most notably in Europe. So our first panel will bring together leading academics and policymakers from around the world to discuss that topic, AI laws, their status, content, and trajectory. At the same time, one of the most vexing questions in AI is how we build confidence in those systems as a matter of technology, but also as a matter of law. And so our second panel will engage on this vital area of auditing and monitoring AI systems to discuss how much progress we're making, how to audit at scale, and ultimately, how societies can start to become satisfied that AI is performing to spec, even in contexts of high trust. Then after a break, later we'll reconvene to focus on the more vertical issues of applied AI policy, looking more deeply at two areas that our task forces are engaging in, healthcare and mobility. We'll talk more about what's to come with those this afternoon. We intend these sessions to be, first and foremost, interactive discussions with dialogue first between and among our panelists, and then in each session with the rest of you joining us with your questions and comments. So I'd encourage you to start thinking about your questions and comments now. And as they come to you, please do enter them live into the Q&A box, which should be right at the bottom of your screen. Now, before introducing our first panel, I want to take a moment and acknowledge the individuals who spent countless hours putting this event together. Greg Dreyfus from Sloan, Helena Martin from the Schwarzman College, and from the AIPF leadership team, Glenn Camiso, Luis Vidagraj, and Professor Alexander Madre, the last two who you'll hear from later in our sessions today. Without further ado, I am delighted to introduce the chair of the AI Policy Forum, dean of the Schwarzman College of Computing, and moderator of our first panel on AI laws, Dan Huttenlocher. Dean Huttenlocher, over to you.
Thank you, David. So I'm really delighted to welcome all of you to this discussion of design questions for AI laws with our distinguished panelists. I'd also like to just give a quick greeting to one of our audience members, Steve Schwarzman. Thank you all for joining us for this exciting group of panelists. AI lawmaking is underway around the globe, raising important questions about how to achieve societally beneficial outcomes from AI and how regulatory frameworks can help achieve that. While defining what constitutes a quote unquote good or effective AI law is highly context dependent, creating an AI law inevitably revolves around certain key design choices. We intend to discuss these choices in the panel and to leverage the diversity of experiences of our group in doing so. We also intend to touch on another critical aspect of successful AI lawmaking, the underlying political process. So first, I'd like to start with panelist introductions and to ask each of the panelists to give a quick 1-minute introduction of themselves in alphabetical order. I'll call on each of you. You know, as a professor, I know what it's like to ask professors, elected officials and ambassadors for 1-minute introductions. I know I'm terrible at them myself. That usually take longer, but thank you all. And I'd like to start with Vice President Kaili.
Thank you so much. You're right. The same happens with politicians. So let me first thank you so much, and the directors also, Mr. Madri, Mr. Vidagraj, for inviting me. So myself, I'm a vice president of strategy innovation for foresight policy and also technology of the European Parliament. I have been chairing the Science and Technology Committee, and we have producing a lot of studies and organizing workshops for emerging technologies or any technologies or scientific outcomes that can affect, influence in our society and our economy, to prepare impact assessment studies also for colleagues in order to proceed to legislation based on high quality of data. This was my main task. And then, of course, I've worked on artificial intelligence. I launched the Center for AI in the Parliament, because AI is transforming actually horizontally all the sectors of our lives. And it's a technology that develops. We still don't know its extent, and we want to ensure that it will be like an ongoing procedure, also to understand the convergence with other technologies. Finally, I'm working on the industry, energy, and economics committees, which also includes like several technologies and how they change in terms of legislation and law. Thank you so much again for having me.
Thank you so much. It's terrific. So next, I'd like to go to Ambassador and Professor Bitange Ndemo.
Thank you asking me to join this panel. My name is Bitange Ndemo. I teach at the University of Nairobi. I also chair the task force in Kenya that is looking into blockchain, and just recently been appointed ambassador to Belgium and the EU. I'm still in Kenya. I haven't moved to Europe, but soon I would. Thank you.
Terrific, thank you. And to Professor Jonathan Zittrain.
Hi there, I'm Jonathan Zittrain. I teach on law, computer science, and public policy at Harvard University, where I helped start the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. I've wrote a book about 10 years ago called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. And I'm working on a sequel right now called Well, We Tried.
Thank you. So I know we're also expecting Representative Ro Khanna, but since both the US Congress and the European Parliament are in session today, we're lucky it's a little later in the afternoon in Europe, but hopefully he'll be along here in a moment. So I'd like to start with some few questions for all three panelists. Before doing that, I'd just like to remind people in the audience, to the degree to which questions occur to you along the way, please enter them as they occur to you, and we'll be pulling those together to share with the panelists at the end. So I'd like to start with some questions on the design of AI laws. And as I said, I'm hoping each of the panelists has something to weigh in on each of these. The first of them is around binding rules versus voluntary guidelines and their relative roles in AI regulation. So when should AI legislation be based on binding rules with penalties, such as proposed in the European Commission's European Artificial Intelligence Act, versus establishing voluntary framework standards or guidelines, such as in the United States National AI Initiative Act of 2020? And what are sort of key considerations and trade-offs that should inform this design choice between binding rules and voluntary guidelines? So feel free to jump in here, folks. I guess I'm not seeing all the panelists at once, so I can't see if somebody raises their hand or not, but.
But I'd be happy to take oh, sorry, I see, no, all right, I'll take a quick crack at it and then defer to others. It's funny, to my ears, as soon as I heard rules versus guidelines, I thought a little bit about rules versus standards, but what you really meant was involuntary versus voluntary. How much is this about government really trying to say, look, here are some boundaries, please don't cross them. And in fact, it's not just please don't cross them, it's don't cross them or you'll, pay. This is called the law, versus kind of a phrase that really was in vogue in the late 1990s, early 2000s around internet regulation, which was industry self-regulation, with the idea being that government might not want to kill a goose laying golden eggs, that the technology and the businesses around it are so new that it's just really hard to get a handle on what's going on and to legislate wisely. So maybe under the shadow of regulation, industry will take care of itself. I think the lessons from the expansion of the internet are that that self-regulatory approach, possibly not to the surprise of many observers, had its limits, that companies can be counted on, in fact, are expected to act in their self-interest. And when they're told to create voluntary guidelines, not only is it hard, but it may be against the collective industry's interests, and so they might slow walk it. So one lesson might be that actually having representative government take an active role early on is a very good idea. It's just that they're challenged by the fact that there appear to be two phases in this kind of environment of regulation. One, too early to tell. Two, too late to do anything about it. And in AI, I think a lot of people would still say we're in the too early to tell stage, but given that there's no middle zone before it's too late, it still might call for some regulation. And finally, that's why coming back around to rules versus standards, it may be really hard. It took the EU like 20 years to finally be like, all right, here's the deal with cookies. And then users see that, modal window show up that's like, would you like all these cookies? And you're like, no, all right, I'll go through the little, menu to say, please turn off these and those and these other cookies. Those are a good example of rules. Everybody understands what the rules are. They may not make sense, but darn it, we know what they are and we're going to try to abide by them. Standards say, don't screw over your users. And then it's up to a regulatory agency. These are not voluntary guidelines, standards. They are saying you can't, and if you do, you're in trouble. But we can't exactly tell you what to do or not do because it's too complicated and we're going to have to work it out together. And that's, in the American context, something like a Federal Trade Commission, which does an enforcement action against one company to set a tone and to investigate, rather than a whole rulemaking trying to specify what can and can't be done. And that may be a very promising path, required, but not so much rules, but standards.
Terrific. Thanks so much. So VP Cayley, this is, I think, probably at the heart of many things you've been thinking about. So it'd be great to hear from you.
Not just that, but actually I have to admit that back in 2016, as chair of the Science and Technology Committee, I was leading a mission to MIT and several other universities. And it was like long ago, so before any hype on AI, that I would say accelerated with the pandemic, because everybody thought it would be a vaccine or like it would help us overcome such a global challenge, that some professors told me and raised my awareness that we are setting up like an ethical code of conduct among academics and scientists to not accept to work on autonomous weapons, or to do that with all the securities that will be there just for defense, but we know what happens when technology is out there. So I realized that AI is here, and that's how we launched the Center for AI. And then I also realized that profit is something that moves more US, and they told me that if Europe doesn't do something about it, then maybe nobody will. Early enough. I wouldn't say it's too early. Maybe some people would argue it's like too late. So it's better because we saw how this technology is developing and how much it can achieve. Still, we cannot even imagine how far it can go. So I would say it's very important to listen to the industry self-regulation and then to intervene, not just with standards, but also I would say a principle-based approach that we are trying to achieve that would allow review of the rules, because I agree the cookies was a failure, but also because the way the industry, let's say, read between the lines and popped up cookies to make it so impossible that we would like in the end have to remove that or like think of a different way to keep our data secure. So we will try to have, let's say, a dynamic approach that it can change, a high risk-based approach where the potentially harmful AI would have more obligations, but then the vast majority, maybe 90% of applications that they are of low risk, they will have much less to do. So like no burden for innovation or for everybody accusing EU that's over-regulating. I'd say we try to have this like gold balance there. So I do believe in law, and this is why I am also in the European Parliament, to protect citizens, to allow innovation to happen, to be tech neutral, and also to avoid harmful AI and retain control. But I think we can say more later on.
Terrific, thank you. So Ambassador Ndemo, do you?
Yeah, I think I would agree with Jonathan. AI in this part of the world is that most countries now understand that artificial intelligence can raise country readiness, increase productivity, or even strengthen national security systems. The technology is increasingly becoming in virtually every sector, from agriculture to health, education, and transportation. Much of this use is happening without legislation. In my country, for example, AI credit scores are actually approving loans. To agree with this, because using credit scores, you can give loans that are non-collateralized. The people who get rejected are not complaining about the technology, haven't reached there yet. They are asking regulators to lower the rates. It will take some time before we start questioning the algorithms. And that is when demand for standards, guidelines, and other mechanisms will be of necessity. In my view, we should not subject we should not subject it to binding rules when we have other means of balancing regulation and innovation. I was a member of the OECD that developed the principles of responsible AI, which should serve as a guide to enable regulators and innovators to work together and with a sustainable regulatory regime. Even at the literature, some of the recent write-ups with the Deloitte to recommend that it's a time that we must begin to look at regulation, regulatory sandboxes, outcome-based regulation, risk-weighted regulation, and collaborative regulation. This is what I would agree with myself. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Yes, VP Kaili, please.
Just because I think it's nice to have such a dialogue. I think also maybe the question should be what kind of AI-powered society we want to live in. And then I think this can lead us into achieving the best mix between regulation and laws, but also the self-regulation of the industry in terms of sector, because I mean, I don't see any harmful AI in agriculture, basically, or health. The opposite, through our regulation, we also achieve to have big investments in artificial intelligence. We allow a lot of exchange of data between scientists in a safe manner, and we enhance collaboration, because what we can, I think, all agree is that it's a across the world technology that we have to agree on. So definitely standards will have to be something that we will comply with, global standards, and maybe international law at that point. So this would be like the minimum agreement that we should have to achieve in order to be able to have such technologies that they go again beyond our borders in EU.
Thank you. So I'd love to come back to a little bit to the two things, to the framing that Professor Zittrain started with around too early to tell and too late to do anything, which I think is it's sort of this stark choice between two bad things, and in particular, whether any of you have thoughts about trying to make those distinctions seems to be a mix of, societal questions about the kinds of benefits we could have. So, for example, Ambassador Ndemo was saying that, in his country, it's some of these decision algorithms are actually enabling types of loans that couldn't happen otherwise, uncollateralized loans. But, we all know in consumer finance, there are lots of opportunities for algorithms also be problematic. So how, so it's one is benefits that we might not have without this, but then also potential costs. Now, I think those are societal things to weigh, but they're also, I think, technical ones in terms of just sort of the development of where the technology is, and if you're, regulating things at a time when there's still a lot of innovation potential and it actually holds back technology innovation. So I heard those two themes come up, but I guess the question I have is, are there ways for industry, for researchers, for elected officials to really try to together address these questions and get more sort of fine-grained about when is something a little too early and we don't want to hold back innovation versus how do we get there before it's scaled to the point that it might be too late. Although I guess I never believe things are really ever too late. They can just be extremely painful. So I don't know if there are thoughts on that, but I think it's a key sort of conundrum, I think, underlying this area that I heard a few of you touch on.
I think that could be relevant in some of the other questions that you'll be asking, meaning that in some sectors, I don't see even regulators going into specific sectors where the AI is actually doing much more or bringing more benefits than any time before. I'm talking about precision agriculture. What could go wrong that the regulators would come into that space? Of course, in health, there are some areas we look at. So we may end up looking at sectoral regimes because having like one regulatory space, then you would end up touching on many areas that require new innovations.
That's a great lead in to thank you to maybe another question here, which is so when we think about regulations broadly outside of the AI arena, they generally tend to be sector specific. So you'll have agricultural regulation, financial regulation, et cetera. And the general purpose nature of AI has also prompted approaches that are more horizontal. It'd be great to hear all of your thoughts on, why is it the case that one might benefit from deviating from sectoral-based regulation? Sort of what are merits and challenges to this horizontal kind of approach versus a vertical approach or sector-specific approach? And is there a potential approach to policy design that could combine benefits of both horizontal and vertical approaches to regulation? Yes, VP Keeley, again, I think that certainly the European Parliament has been looking a lot at cross-cutting, so it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, exactly. So I'd say basically for us to have a horizontal framework it's achieving also legal certainty to AI developers, and it also and providers that they can deal with like one European framework. We also have like different approaches per member state, and I think it's very important to achieve that, to have principle-based approaches, as I mentioned, in order to ensure that there will be human-centric AI. It's a bit different if you look at AI from like its societal impact, but if you say it's human-centric, I mean, we need to have control, we need to have human oversight, then you put like much more safeguards there and you're more careful. And if you say I want to have a trusted AI, again, for powerful applications that general purpose AI goes like beyond sectors. then you definitely need to have high quality of standards, and you need to ensure that when people use these apps and to support them to use these apps, you have created such a strong framework in an horizontal manner. In Europe, whenever you use something like any medication, you know that it has been checked and you know that you can trust it. So you know there are controls there. We have to achieve the same with AI. I think it would also benefit AI because like more data will come, people will use more applications in a safe manner, and I mean data being constantly generated. And I think the benefits that we will achieve, they will be great for humans, but also our economy and our society. So I think it would also create the ground for what we want to see tomorrow to happen. So scientists want to see the direction that we want to have. Again, I would say we have to start asking what kind of AI we want. We want it to replace or to complement us. And I think this would be very interesting if we would go like to justice and we believe that AI could replace the justice system, the judges. Well, actually, I could really argue that maybe it cannot really, or at least it might in a very, very, long, far from here future, because there are social metrics, ethical metrics. It has to do with like different cultures and education systems, and it's so complex that I think the AI we need to achieve is to complement us and to help us make better decisions, to help us have better healthcare system, biotech, agriculture. You have to be able to save water. You have to be able to be more accurate. So several amazing applications in an horizontal manner.
Great, thank you. So I know, Professor Zittrain, you've thought about a number of related issues here. It'd be great to.
Yeah, sure. I feel like their past two questions relate really nicely to each other, and they both explain to me why Vice President Cayley has such a difficult job here. Like, this is really hard to do, because when you think about horizontal versus vertical, is it sectoral, or do you try to have a grand unifying theorem of regulation? There's a real appeal to a grand unifying theorem because it helps when you can't predict what sectors will be affected by an upstream technology, and you're trying to get people thinking about it who don't have to have that sectoral expertise, so that it isn't like some elaborated tax code that nobody can really understand unless they've steeped in it. But the problem with the kind of grand unifying theorem is, first, it really requires not only a great sense of what the new technology that calls for perhaps regulation is doing out there, but it calls for a kind of unified theory of the values that you're trying to protect and advance, and how to resolve some of the trade-offs that Professor Nadema was talking about, where, how do you know what you're favoring between innovation or individual liberty or collective security? And I guess the reason I think it relates to the last question is too early to tell. Do we mean too early politically? Like, I think especially for governments that have to be responsive at the ballot box to public concerns, is this a lunch pail issue? How much is AI regulation something that people are going to cast their vote on the basis of how well that was done? And I think right now, unless it is framed in a direct sectoral way, that's not the kind of thing that maybe activates voters very much. And the other thing is, when we're talking about AI, and I assume we're kind of talking specifically about machine learning, because that in the past 5 to 10 years is where so many of the surprising advances have come, as the data sets have gotten bigger, the PhDs have had more time to work, and the processors have gotten faster. And if it's machine learning, it's kind of like asbestos. It's kind of like distributed everywhere. It's wholesale and not retail. I just got a hamburger at McDonald's. Was machine learning part of that sequence that brought the hamburger to my hand? Probably, but then how do we identify it? That makes it a lot harder to know even what sector we're talking about regulation for. When we think of something like Clearview AI, which is somebody went to the trouble of just scraping a ton of profiles off of social media and associated tags and names, and then deployed an ML algorithm to train up a system so that now any picture of me snapped from, this panel live is one that could be instantly identified as me, because at some point I dared to have a Facebook account. What sector is that falling into? I guess it's a new sector that it was too early to tell. This was just some guy doing it, and now it's probably too late to do anything about it. There's too many customers of this. It's out there. That represents to me a great example of why acting early is good, why having the values up front that we're trying to vindicate is really important, and why you kind of need broad cross-jurisdictional consensus, or something like that can just be set up in choose your jurisdiction, but offered to everybody.
That's great. And demo.
Yeah, we went through a debate like this when we first began, when we first started to use mobile money. The central bank was saying, we know nothing about telecommunication sector, said we know nothing about money. And it was easy to say, forget about it. This is a product that we don't need. But nevertheless, we said, let's move forward with it and see what would happen. And we can learn who would become the better regulator. Eventually, we ended up with the vertical regulatory regime where we'll do certain things, and then the telecommunications regulator will do other things. But the outcome of that is that mobile money has disrupted banking sector in such a way that we have created greater inclusivity, and we are beginning to see new innovations that are coming. It has inspired new other innovations in other areas in developed countries. So if we didn't act, we would have actually killed the whole thing altogether. Then government later on tried to create a cross-sectoral regulator, which is called Competitions Authority. We have had problems with it because it lacks the legitimacy in regulating certain sectors which require professional knowledge. So it's very difficult to actually say this is the best way we can move forward.
Yeah, no, I think those are really both an extremely good analogy with mobile money. It's another one of those things nobody really understood very well, and it still don't understand. But also the point about sectoral legitimacy, I think, is a very very important one. So there are a couple things that came up here that I'd just like to raise again and see if people have a little more to say on, because I think so. One is Jonathan said, if AI is machine learning, and I think there is this underlying question, and to me at least, it's maybe a little more present in the cross-sectoral approaches. What is AI? Because if what you're regulating is, if you're regulating something in banking, it's banking. But if you're regulating AI and it's not clear that either societally or technically we have clear definitions of what that is, how do we think about that? And then VP Kaili mentioned sort of trust in AI, and this is something that I think is both extremely important, but often I'm frustrated, personally at least, in terms of how it's talked about, because I think it's even a legitimate question. What does it mean to trust a technology? I think when we think about trust as a sort of human attribute, it's something that you build up over time with sort of interactions and expectations that get developed, and you can sort of interrogate one another. I don't mean in the bad sense, but have an interrogatory conversation to say, do we share values or not? How do I come to trust you? And so I think two things that to me are really important here are just around thinking about what is AI if we're regulating it in a horizontal fashion. And if trusted AI is important, which I agree at some high intuitive level it is, what do we mean by trust? So so those would be two questions I think that sort of came up in the things that people mentioned here that if people have additional comments on, I think would be terrific. I think they're things that we're all struggling with. Yeah, Eva, please.
I can always start because I'm working now on the legislation. So the file of Artificial Intelligence Act, we've long been waiting, it has arrived, and we all struggled with the definition. We took on the definition of OECD, so to allow room of the AI to develop and mature even more and to see its extents. But if I would dare to have my own definition, I would say it depends what you want to achieve. So AI basically is trying to replicate human intelligence. It's an artificial intelligence. So basically it receives knowledge and processes the knowledge and information, the data in this case, in order to achieve, to think, to create, to take a decision, to solve a problem, and optimize your solutions. So it can use machine learning. It's not just machine learning. It could be very simple. It could also lead us to super intelligence, to go beyond our understanding. Depends on what kind of data you add in the equation and what kind of metrics you take under consideration. So at this point where humans are in control of the algorithm, it would be as imperfect as we are, but it can develop in a manner where we remove the, let's say, biases that we might replicate through the data that we choose to include, and make it more inclusive and make it more transparent to understand and more simple to decide, again, what we want to achieve. One thing that I believe, because you said what is also trust, I'd say for Europe, it's very simple, because first of all, we want to achieve what we have offline. Online, they are interlinked. You can influence your life with a bad online decision. So when I talk about principle-based approach, basically we want to ensure that we will have our respect of human rights, democratic values in place. We will, and when we say ban, not the technology, we don't regulate AI, we regulate its application, so how you use it, which means mass surveillance. We don't want to have it. It can save lives, it can protect you from terrorists. We can have both privacy and safety. We don't want to have subliminal manipulation of your perception through your Facebook tailor-made, let's say, newsfeed. We want to ensure that you understand that there are more things going on than what you see. We want to avoid social scoring and exclusion with AI. So these are the main topics, because our mindset is to avoid negative outcomes, and of course all the advances of AI to be able to allow the industry and people to benefit from in a safe and trusted manner. And this is the 90%. I just don't talk about it 90% of when I talk about AI.
Great, thank you. Professor Zittrain, maybe Ambassador Ndemo, you look like you were about to speak.
Yes, I just trust is actually the consistency, even in human beings. If you told me the truth consistently, I would say you are an honest person. If AI could consistently provide similar, something that I can say is consistent and it is the same, then I would say it's trusted AI. Why am I saying this? Because there are several areas where AI has been deployed and has consistently provided the outcomes we expected. It gets into problems just like when we started with the internet, we began to trust it. I will send you and receive it until cyber criminals came in and started to divert it and stuff. Those are things now we must look at. How do we protect trusted AI to work on several things, from health to agriculture to transportation and other things. That's what I can.
I think that's terrific. I really, that was great. Thank you. Professor Zittrain.
I share your sense that we don't really have a firm consensus around the world of what AI means, nor do we have one about what trust would mean in this sphere. And so it's really great to have opportunities to say, well, all right, here's what it should mean. On the trust side of things, I remember when, as a technical matter, a trusted system, particularly in the realm of copyright enforcement, back in the days of worrying that people would push bits from here to there that some third party did not want them to push because the third party owned a copyright on them or something, that trusted systems were ones that could be trusted as against their users. That if you have a trusted music distribution system, that the users can't copy the music within it. You have a trusted system in an old-fashioned taxi cab where the meter, at least used to be in the city of Boston, had a wax seal indicating that it had not been opened by the driver, and therefore you could trust that it was recording the right amount on the meter for the distance driven. And that's a very different technical and useful use of the word trust that is not at all related to the colloquial use when people think, you know, can I trust this technology? What they're saying is it out to get me, or is it acting in my interests or some other thing? How do I understand this technology that has just importuned me to tell it a lot about myself, or that is watching me very closely, my eye movements, how long my mouse arrow hovers over something? The amount of refinement of data collection that can then be used, thanks to machine learning, to make some inferences about the people who are contributing that information, knowingly or not, opens up a real question of should they be in a position to trust that system? And to my eye, that's probably, when I think of trusted AI, the use that I would think is the one we should, if we're going to apply the word at all, use it to. I think too often, though, it's about if somebody is using this tech, if they want to deviate from the rules, can the tech enforce against them something else? And that really is a form of trust. I'd also just offer up as quick alternative definitions I think I've seen out there. Does the system do what it says on the can? If it does, all right, it's trustworthy. If it doesn't, either because there's bias latent in the training set or a reuse of some kind of it that it worked well in one domain, but then it got thoughtlessly applied to another. Those sorts of things are contributors to a system you can't trust because its practice no longer matches its theory. And finally, in social media, I think it's fair to ask, how is social media technology in particular, driven by machine learning around engagement or some other goal about what to show people, what kind of world they end up perceiving as they look at one TikTok video after another, or peruse a Twitter or a Facebook feed? How is that technology affecting relationships among the users of that platform, and therefore within society as the platforms become so popular? I think that's a trust question distinct from all the others. And when I look at some of the regulation, for instance, emerging in China around AI, a lot of it appears to be in that category, saying, wait a minute, a lot's going on with social media and the government isn't producing the technology. We want to make sure it doesn't get used in the following ways.
That was terrific, thanks. So I would agree very heartily on the last point about the role of machine learning in social media and what is it really doing. I think, I mean, it's something I've written about a bit, and I think it's, we sort of backed into that in some sense. The machine learning technology didn't exist in ways that could be useful in those systems when those systems were first created. And then it started allowing an incredible amount of sort of personalization and other things that I think require some more thought in in the framing of trust. I love the concreteness of, does it do what it says on the can? Because in particular, I think for many uses of AI, it's not, there isn't a clear statement. There isn't a can that says something on the outside. And so I think that's another really important aspect of trust that often doesn't come up when people talk about trust. It's sort of trust in some abstract sense. I mean, in some sense, yours is trust in the sense of a contract. I mean, if I tell you it's going to do X, it should do X. But if I don't tell you what it's going to do at all, what does it mean to trust it? And I think that is a really fundamental question that we have here. So thank you all. That's really terrific. So, so in several of the things that have come up in answers to questions here, the question of data, how data is gathered, how it's used, and also questions of metrics, or what I might, as a tech nerd, call objective functions, the things that are being optimized or extracted by machine learning from that data have come up. And I think there are two fairly natural ways. So just to go into the third question here, there are two fairly natural ways to think about consumer protection and regulation for AI systems in this regard. One of them, which is embraced in the EU's proposed regulations, focuses on mandating validity and representativeness of inputs, like the training data, metrics, things of that form. And the other centers more on controlling the outputs of some systems, which one could think of as akin to regulation in a number of sectors. So like in finance, it would be akin to the disparate impact doctrine in consumer finance. So what are relative merits of, if we think of this as regulating inputs and regulating outputs, and you should all feel free to disagree even with that formulation, but if we think of that formulation, what are the relative merits of those approaches? What might be good frameworks for thinking about those corresponding choices to be made? And again, back to the sort of thing in the previous question, are there ways to combine, just like with horizontal and vertical, are there ways to combine these viewpoints to do a better job of achieving societally beneficial outcomes?
I think the problem isn't around inputs, outputs. It's who makes the regulation we are experiencing here. We have African Union, which is looking towards a single digital market, and because of that, they come up with regulations which have failed to impact what is happening on the ground. Because even is vote for those regulations, they don't use them within the state, and because they look at like this is a sovereign state, they forget that they are looking at the regional level. So until the politics of national is dealt with, I think even EU, that problem is there. We need to have legitimate legislations. What is accepted as legitimate, meaning accepted by the themselves, because the inputs, outputs. I would say that we don't have a problem with that in Africa, for example. But the biggest problem we have is legitimacy of these regulations within and outside. We are working on the cross-border digital payment, and that is the problem we are getting most. We are not looking at input or output. Maybe others can say where the pain points are with respect to this.
Terrific, thank you. Either VP Cayley or Professor Zittrain? Any thoughts on this one?
I can always intervene. I just don't know how much time I can take. But I would say that in my understanding is like the quality of data that we use to train, test, and validate an algorithm, an equation, the metrics that we use in order to achieve, again, what we want, a prediction, support for a decision, a suggestion, a recommendation. So we have also to think how we collect those data. We have to test enough in order to achieve this like trusted environment, and then we will decide how much input we need, what kind of output we should suggest. Still, it's in our hands. I mean, human decide. You were having a very interesting debate with Jonathan. I'd say we all have AI in our hands. We all use, I don't know, Google Maps or Waze or like applications that we outsource a decision of the shortest route, even if it's a route that we do every day. We might have like own our app, and then it tells us like, listen, here there's a traffic jam, unexpected one, and you can avoid it. So we outsource trust already because we tested it, and we realized that when we didn't follow what it suggested, we got stuck. So I think this is what, in the end, AI would help us do. As of inputs and outputs, I think also it's very important to decide what kind of input we want, because I mean, really collecting data that we generate can be constant. You know that we all have our mics on constantly in all applications. You don't have the option to switch off your mic. So it can listen to you, it could suggest you where you want to, or it basically says that we know you better than you know yourself. So I can suggest what's the best destination for your vacations. And then I want to engage you, I'm going to attract your attention, and then to ensure that you will, in the end, book this journey for you. So these are like thin lines. We need to ensure that citizens will have options. By default, by design, they will be able to allow specific data to be used. Then we have also to create environments where scientific data can be exchanged in order to achieve different scientific output. So I would say it's a quite a complex matrix. Again, the principles are the ones that can guide us through to achieve the best of AI. But I have to say, it's like, for the time being, it's a bit still blurry, because depending on also the several other technologies that we have, computer power, we have more IoT in the table, we can decide also what kind of outputs we need AI for. But anyway, it's quite interesting, because in my mindset, I think in most of the Europeans' mindset, it's quite clear what we want to achieve and like what we want to avoid in terms of principles.
Jonathan.
It's such a wonderfully and appropriately specific question that turns into, I think, a really profound question too, as one tries to answer it. To me, when we think about regulating the inputs to a machine learning system, it's because we might be indifferent to the substantive output of the system so long as it's behaving the way it should. And an example might be, if it's a system producing answers about people, we don't want it to be biased. We have some definition of bias so that we know when it is behaving that way. And it has to do with often garbage in, garbage out. And so why not fix the garbage on the way in, and then whatever comes out, all right, like it's almost like in a political context saying, set aside what you think the parliament or the Congress should vote for, so long as the votes are counted properly and people, the representatives were each casting a free vote, that is the correct answer, because the point is to have a functioning parliament. But often the correct answer might be the wrong answer. And then you're left saying, well, the output of that parliament was wrong. There was no issue on the process. I mean, maybe the people voting were mistaken, and that's an input problem. But if you have some independent sense, according to one's values, about what you think is the right kind of society, what's the right kind of output, then at that point, dealing with inputs feels like, irrelevant. And so there will be times when you surely want to be paying attention to the input side of things. And in the technical space, things like differential privacy is a great example of a technology designed in the privacy field to change the inputs that are available to researchers to answer questions so that they can only answer questions at broad aggregate levels and not end up learning about the individuals whose data is helping to answer those aggregate questions. But I think a good example on the output side, and this is where to me it becomes profound, you had mentioned consumer finance and loans earlier as a domain where machine learning could be potentially very helpful to a bank, because if the point of the bank is to figure out whether to extend a loan to somebody or if to extend it at what interest rate, having some sense of the risk of non-payment lets you decide on your loan. I mean, it's about uncertainty, and anything that narrows your uncertainty will let you price your loan better. But it may be that for all sorts of reasons, an accurate sense of uncertainty will lead to outputs that are not what we want. That as a society, we actually appreciated that banks had limits to their certainty, so they kind of had to loan to a bunch of people or insure a bunch of people. I mean, imagine medical insurance in the risk spreading sense, where you could predict up front who was going to be injured. If you could, insurance doesn't make any sense because you're already pricing exactly what their future is going to hold for them. Machine learning at its outer boundaries holds one medical condition at a time, promise for understanding this person looks healthy, but in fact, they're not going to be around 5 years from now. I'm not writing them a life insurance policy. That is a profound problem if what you want are families to be able to, continue to live if a breadwinner happens to die. And that's a problem that is not about tweaking the life insurance algorithm. It's about how a society cares for its members. And when the crutch of uncertainty stands to be removed through powerful AI, that's to me a much bigger question than what is it to do machine learning prediction on life insurance or banking right.
So maybe I'll make a quick comment, and I see Ava turned off her mute. Sometimes I think she wants to too, which would be great. I think one really important thing there that came out to me, which you sort of talked about, crutch of uncertainty, is just in general, I think algorithmic approaches to things tend to homogenize outcomes or reduce variability. In fact, automation in general, it's not just algorithmic. In automation, like if you think about a good factory, it's one where there's not a lot of variability. And so when we're doing variability reduction in these kinds of domains, I think which sort of that's a version of the crutch of uncertainty is one version of that. I think those are really challenging things that we need to be thinking about. I think that's a really super important issue. Ava, and then I know I want to turn to specific questions to each of you and turn to the audience. I've been having too much fun here, so I've been keeping an eye on the time, but please go ahead and then we'll.
No, just a question. I mean, like, I was talking to some people from the fintech industry and they told me something I hadn't thought. They say, when we use AI or like any digital assistant, to understand how much we can trust someone to lend you money and like reduce our risk. Usually someone that already has savings is considered to be more trusted. It's not the case in the end. So maybe trusted people are like more creative ones that they start, they have a better idea, they can present it in a more credible manner. So there are tough questions there to answer. That's why it could I believe in human oversight in these systems, definitely to be there. Since of course, there are so many unpredictable events that could take place. And Jonathan basically mentioned about this, like what life is about like unexpected events. I don't know if we would all like to have everything predicted or somebody to make the perfect choice every time for us instead of us thinking for ourselves, if this is like a world we want to live in. And just like I remembered one example in UK, which was I would say very, very interesting for us, like it was eye-opening. They used AI for the grading system. So they tried to grade students using an AI system without human oversight. So in the end, this grading system completely failed because it favored private school students over disadvantaged ones. It increased basically the inequalities, not just replicated, but even increased because they had less options because of the final grading. And the the problem was that even the prime minister himself, he said like, yeah, but the algorithm didn't manage. So there was no accountability, like human accountability, it was the algorithm. So I think these are very interesting cases that can show us like what's the direction we want to move ahead to.
Thank you. So I wanted to now turn to some questions about underlying political process, which did come up a little bit in some of the things that each of you were saying. And these will be targeted each of you individually because they're about the kinds of processes you've been involved in. So, so again, just I'm doing the alphabetical by last name ordering. So, so Vice President Keela, Europe is building a robust legal architecture for regulating data and AI, which spans from data protection to the digital services and markets, and of course, the European AI Act that's in the works. How is the European Parliament building political consensus for such a far-reaching and ambitious legislative agenda?
Well, we almost completed our legislative effort. We want to, let's say, follow the example of GDPR. So we want to achieve something to regulate somehow the internet or the applications that could be harmful. And this is how we acted. We took like several pieces of legislation that they come up and they complete this puzzle of translating our offline principles. And in the online environment, we updated our competition policy. We have now the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, the Data Governance Act. Now the Data Act, like how we can exchange data, how the public sector could like give data in a safe manner to the industry and the industry between them. And we also have the digital economy, digital finance package. So we are completing, let's say, how we can translate and update our offline regulations into the online world. And still we are working on the online identity. This would also be essential for the future of AI and the metaverse. Like you can have multiple identities. We need to overcome also barriers we have. So we worked on different pieces of the files. We have several opinions from different committees, because it affects everything. It's a horizontal, transformative power AI. And in the end, we have these like trialogues that we are trying now to achieve into agreeing in the basic principles. And we are collaborating with our like-minded partners and transatlantic alliance also to ensure that we have like also common understanding, because as I said in the beginning, I believe we need an international law, because this is a technology that goes and functions, and it can achieve its best potential when it goes across borders. So this is how we work on these kind of files, and we are still on the AI one and the data one to complete everything. We hope we're going to have a GDPR principle-based approach in the end that can be revised. And the cookies, hopefully, when we have the revision, will not bother us so much.
Thank you. Ambassador Ndemo, so a lot of the discussion and debate around AI regulations centered on Europe, the US, and China. However, most of the world's population lives elsewhere. How are African nations thinking about the regulation of AI priorities and concerns that you see?
Thank you again. Yes, it is true that Europe, America, and China lead the way. However, adoption of AI in Africa is growing simply because it is solving problems, the many problems that are specific to Africa. For example, doctor shortages and lack of medical access for rural Africans are being addressed by startups in Kenya, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. They have started to employ AI doctors and to take advantage of the expanding use of phones to collect the data, improve administrative efficiency, and increase treatment coverage. So concerns center around the capacity building and the lack of legal and regulatory framework. For example, I chair the task force which is looking at the policy framework for AI and the blockchain. So few countries have attempted to develop a legal framework. Senegal, for example, has taken steps to establish a regulatory and policy environment for AI startups. The Startup Act legitimizes Senegal's digital strategy and made the country the second in Africa after Tunisia, actually, to pass AI startup registration. While some laws are not specific to AI, they are nonetheless useful. In Kenya, for example, the new data privacy law establishes limitations on how business can use technology to manage, keep, and exchange personal data. The Protection of Personal Information Act in South Africa controls automated decision-making, the process of deciding by automated means without involvement. So the African Union, which is the highest decision-making organ, has come up with many initiatives. It has advocated for AI legislation to handle benefits and hazards for Africans. In summary, AI legal and regulatory environment in Africa is slowly growing, mostly being implemented in piecemeal. This may change soon as the African Union tries to impress upon the countries to develop means of regulating AI in Africa. We have made progress, especially in Rwanda is coming in. So I would say 8 countries have made a lot of progress towards developing AI legislations. I think most of them are looking at developing the capacities to understand algorithms and other things. They have the legislations in place, but adoption is moving very fast in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Professor Zittrain, you mentioned China AI regulations a little earlier in one of your comments. China is one of the jurisdictions advancing AI laws. What do you think about what China's recently enacted laws on data and AI might be informative to the rest of the world, and what other jurisdictions could learn from them?
Yeah, I've looked with curiosity and at a conceptual distance, but looked at January's Internet Information Service Algorithm Recommendation Management Regulations, issued by no fewer than 5 state agencies in China. And among the elements that might be of broader interest include general transparency regulations. For instance, they stipulate that tech companies have to inform users in a conspicuous way if algorithms are being used to push content on them. That might be exactly the kind of thing that Vice President Cayley is familiar with and behind for European regulation on cookies and other disclosures. And of course, one question all of us confront when we think about the kind of nominal value of that is, when do you get notification fatigue? So that, you know, it's just, the state of California has determined as you're entering the building that there are some toxic materials inside, for which the general user is like, well, they must not be that bad, or I assume the building would be chained shut. So I'm going into the building. So figuring out what role transparency has and whether the transparency is meant to be retail transparency to a user so that user can then make choices that reasonable users would differ upon about whether they want to continue using the service now that they've been notified a little bit more about how it works? Or is it wholesale transparency so that trusted proxies, public interest groups or others, have a chance to say, oh, wait a minute, they just, in this fine print, we found the following things. Look at the ingredients on this label. Most of you don't consult the ingredients of this food, but gosh, there's this thing and you should be worried about it. That's allowing third parties to try to have a chance to understand and serve a function between the user and the company involved. So transparency is certainly something that any regulator is going to be confronting and trying to implement in a meaningful way. There's a lot of the regulation focused on price discrimination, a technical term meaning on the basis of some guess or insight about a customer to be able to quote that customer a different price for the same product or service, a different price than some other customer might be getting. And the promise of personalization can mean to a vendor a chance to do that. And particularly if it's harder for the person to shop around or the thing in question is not easily substituted for, or they're locked into an ecosystem, price discrimination can shift a surplus between what somebody's willing to pay and what somebody can afford to charge from the buyer over to the seller. And economists will debate whether that's a big deal or not. But in the meantime, consumers would prefer to get the surplus themselves. And it's interesting to see how much the law is focused on avoiding price discrimination on the basis of what you know about somebody. There's a bit that sure seems to be geared around the governance of social media, something like TikTok in particular, online addiction, which I think governments, including that of China's, has recognized as itself a problem. And so I think in the wake of these regulations, you see ByteDance showing 5-second videos urging users to log off after they've been watching videos for a long time. Now, whether that's totally pro forma, like kind of, you know, the side of the box of cigarettes says, by the way, these will kill you, like enjoy, like we just tried to market these to you, we priced it right, like we're really trying to get the cigarettes in your hands. Now reconsider whether you really want to smoke. That's kind of asking of the platforms something about that. But I think online, I mean, addiction, again, a loaded word, but online services can be compelling in that we want to check in them and use them, even if they don't make us in the moment happy, and even if it's not really making us feel good later. That is evidence of some phenomenon for which government regulation might be helpful, and there's some evidence of that here in China's law. And finally, there's a bunch of broad-based stuff I can read from a translation, courtesy of machine learning at Google, requiring algorithm recommendation service providers to adhere to the mainstream value orientation, to actively disseminate positive energy, to establish and improve the feature database for identifying illegal and bad information, and take corresponding measures if illegal or bad information is found. And algorithms shall not be used to influence online public opinion. And what jumps out to me are the prospects first of a really broad standard. That's not telling you exactly what you can and can't do, which I think for a government can be quite useful because it gives them an opportunity to figure out later, but still point to the vague law and say, no, that's what we meant, that's covered. And also, especially when you see something like algorithms shall not be used to influence online public opinion, that's both government as protector, perhaps against undue manipulation of people by private parties, but we know that all governments are going to have an interest in conveying their own message to the public and shaping what their public or other publics see. And that gets back to one of the true puzzles of AI regulation here and regulation more generally, which is that we're looking to governments to both be our protectors, to bring their might and their force and their wisdom in the interaction, which is often lopsided between big platforms and technology suppliers and individual users. And at the same time, the government is a player in that dynamic and has its own goals and is scrambling to use all of these new technologies to reduce its own uncertainties and to extend its own power. And what kind of regulation would apply backwards to governments to restrain their own activities, I think is a great open question to revisit as we think about the regulation possibilities here.
Terrific. Thank you all on that. So we only have a couple of minutes left. I did want to at least jump to the most upvoted question from the audience and see what anyone has to think about that as we wrap up. So if there's increasing national or regional regulation, what prevents companies in one jurisdiction from launching AI applications that are accessible over the internet and others? In the end, will we need to bar citizens from using applications that come from different jurisdictions? Is this sort of going to be a sort of a splintering of the internet or algorithmic availability of online algorithms? Any thoughts? It's a good question. My crystal ball is much worse than anyone else's. So
we've certainly seen this play out over the past 20 years with internet regulation, with very much that kind of question asked, which the answers that have emerged are, if it's a global company, it may find itself, depending on the kinds of services it wants to offer, really hard to offer them in a given jurisdiction without having any servers there, without having any salespeople there, any executives. It's possible. You could do it at a distance, but you're right that governments with enough of an interest in precluding that can make it so that it's a gray market activity. And that would then be control on the supply side, just trying to say, look, we'll give you a business license to operate here, but here's what you have to do. So one example would be like Skype has its own joint venture in China, and it has very different affordances and standards for privacy and for responsiveness to government inquiry than the Skype that Microsoft bought and operates in many other jurisdictions. Could the same thing be true of machine learning capabilities? The asbestos-like character of machine learning makes that a much harder question to answer. So now we're getting sectoral. What are the kinds of things a government would want to restrict or promote in a given use of machine learning? The details of that might affect just how much it could expect local jurisdiction over the answer to that question. And how much we want to have global standards is another question worth answering there.
Well, thank you. We've come to the end of our allotted time, and I want to respect everyone's time, but especially the panelists. This has been really fantastic discussion. I thank you all for your participation and for your insights, and look forward with all of you to continuing the work that you do and being of service at MIT in any ways that we can. So thank you all so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for an excellent discussion. Thank you, Dan, and everybody, Professor, Ambassador. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.